I am here once again with our State Senator Bruce Tarr. Hi, Bruce. How are you?
Hi, Heather. I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. So
Good.
for informal sessions, we still have a lot to talk about.
We do. And, that's one of the things that we've talked about from time to time is that when we go from formal sessions to informal sessions, it doesn't mean things stop. And sometimes there's a misimpression out there about that. But there are definitely things happening, and there are things required to happen, both by the Constitution and by our statutes in Massachusetts. So while you may think it's a quiet time, it isn't necessarily.
Well, we're going to get to the legislation that we talked about the last time, which is the closeout supplemental bill and the economic development bill. That all sounds very boring. If in fact, we're really going to talk about, first of all, refunds, tax refunds, right?
Absolutely.
So the other stuff is really exciting too, but let's start with those Chapter 62F tax refunds.
Well, sure. So folks may remember that in 1986, there was a ballot initiative and it passed substantially to be able to limit the amount of total tax revenue that Massachusetts can collect. And for a while now, it's been clear that we were going to exceed that threshold amount. And in fact, the Secretary of Administration and Finance had pegged that number at about $2.9 billion. The next step that was required was for the auditor of the Commonwealth to verify that number. Auditor Bump did and put out a report that not only confirmed the number, but also her method of analyzing it so that it would be completely transparent. And the phase that we're in now is the administration is preparing to be able to issue rebate checks. Now, some folks were a little disappointed that the checks won't be able to be issued until sometime in November. And the question has been asked, well, if you know the number of the surplus, why can't you do it right away? And the answer to that question is that October 21st is the last time that someone could file a tax return or an amended tax return. And so we won't know completely the amount of the surplus until after that date. So far, everything is a projection. But it's a verified projection on this is what we have right now, but that still could change. So the best guess we have right now is that in sometime in November, the checks are going to issue. But in the meantime, if folks may be curious about how much they're getting, the administration has set up a website that not only has frequently asked questions and answers, but that also has a calculator so that based on the amount of taxes that you paid, you can estimate what you'll be getting back by way of a rebate. And as we discussed off camera, Heather, the link to that website is long. And so I'm not going to try to recite it here, but we'll provide it to you. And maybe it could be placed somewhere where folks can see it. But it can be found in shorthand at mass.gov, which is generally the state government's website. And if you search Chapter 62F, you can find it that way. But we'll provide you with a more precise link as well.
Okay. So, Senator, what do people have to do to get their refund?
Nothing. So the good news is that the rebate will be calculated based on your tax return, and it will be done either through direct deposit or through a check. And so that'll be made clear as well on the website. And frankly, Heather, there was a lot of discussion about that, about whether you should have to apply or whether there should be some sort of a process. But as of right now, it appears that the checks and the rebates will be issued, I hate to use the word automatically, but without any additional effort by the taxpayer.
So people should be looking in their mailboxes mid-November for these checks.
That's the best estimate we have right now, is that it will be sometime in November. And I think mid-November is probably the best range to be thinking about that in. Yeah.
It's a lot of times, with a stack of junk mail, people might throw something away, and this will be very important.
Absolutely not. We want to make sure you're on the lookout for this. We worked hard to make sure that the law is complied with and that this money will be going back out. So we certainly want to make sure that folks are looking for it in their mail and can take advantage of it when it comes.
Okay. And is there any sort of was there a percentage of, what are the calculations to figure out how much refund? I mean, I realize each person can go on that link and calculate their own, but how did the state decide what we should get? Or we won't know until October 21st, is that right?
Oh, we won't, but it's basically taking the amount, $2.9 billion, and dividing that across the taxpayers and then figuring out how it allocates. So again, I think the best thing to do is for folks to go to the website and be able to check it there. But there have been some numbers reported in the press, but it really, the best way to do it is just to go and put in your numbers and calculate it. And it's, for most people, it's not insignificant.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you, Massachusetts. But we can connect this story to the next one, which is the Economic Development Bill and the Closeout Supplemental Bill. And that Economic Development Bill was supposed to have a lot of tax relief in it, including a rebate, but we've yet to see it, right?
That's correct. So just to go back a little bit, the House and the Senate each passed a version of that Economic Development Bill. The conference committee did not complete its work by the end of the formal session. And so the bill didn't get final approval from the legislature to go on to the governor's desk. But it's interesting to remember that that conference committee is still appointed. It is still, in theory, capable of getting together and producing a final document and reporting it to the floors of the House and the Senate in the form of a conference committee report. The challenge is that because we're now in informal session, in order for it to be taken up, there would need to be consensus. Any member could object to it being taken up and really stop it in its tracks. So in theory, it's possible. And I would hope that we would get to that point where it would get before the House and the Senate. There's a couple of possibilities here. And when we talk about it being done by consensus, I would remind folks that in the early days of the pandemic, when the only way the House and the Senate could meet was in an informal session, we passed major legislation by consensus. We needed to be able to respond to the pandemic and the issues that we needed to do, like emergency measures of all nature that we've talked about. So it is not impossible for it to happen, even with complex subjects. The other possibility is the legislature could agree to suspend its own rules. We could agree to come back to a formal session to take up a conference committee report if we had one. The complicating factor there is that, at least on the part of the Senate, our emergency rules, which allowed folks to participate remotely in a formal session, ended at the end of the formal session. And so for that to happen now, folks would have to come to the Senate chamber and vote to suspend the rules. But that's certainly a possibility. So this is not something that we can write off at this point as being impossible to do. It's not impossible to do. And as you point out, there's very significant tax relief in the packages that were included by the House and the Senate. There were some differences in the tax package. The most significant ones relate to how we deal with the estate tax. Both branches agreed to raise the threshold for taxation on someone's estate from $1 to $2 million, but they used different methods in order to get to that goal. So there are some differences, and the differences are not trivial, and they're not merely technical. But the point is that both branches are on record as agreeing to the total and agreeing to the general categories of relief that would be provided. So I still remain hopeful. You can probably sense that from my comments here.
I sure can, yeah.
That we can get something done. And the other thing that's important, Heather, is that not only is tax relief in that bill, that economic development bill, but there are major investments in important things. And I'm going to give you one example. And I'm a little bit hesitant to do this because the bill certainly hasn't been finalized. But one of the things that is included in the Senate version of the bill is $1.4 million to design a regional training facility for our fire departments. And this is something that hasn't necessarily gotten a lot of attention yet, but the Essex County Fire Chiefs are a very strong organization. They're very unified in their desire to build a facility in our area to be able to do local training for our firefighters. Right now, the training facility, as you may know, is in Stowe, Massachusetts, and it's a wonderful facility. I've actually participated in some programming there myself. But the difficulty is that in order for firefighters to get to Stowe, takes them out of service and is a logistical challenge. Now, no one in the region is arguing that we shouldn't still have that facility and folks shouldn't still go there. But what the argument is that localized training would be an incredible benefit to public safety in our region. So that's just one example of the kinds of things that are in that economic development bill and why it would be important to pass it, not just because of the tax relief, which is certainly important on its own, but why it would be important to pass it generally if we could get to that point.
Well, and I had actually read that the governor turned to a legislator and said, but where's the money for the climate bill? And they said, it's in the economic development bill. Is that right?
Well, there certainly is some spending for things of that nature in the climate bill. But the climate bill was not as much a spending document.
Right.
So that's why we have to turn to the economic development bill.
The fund, yeah.
We did put some money aside for the programming that's in the climate bill.
So, and what about the closeout supplemental bill?
So these two things are very intimately related, and I'm glad we're talking about them in the way that we are. So we have to close the books on the prior fiscal year, which ended at the end of June, the beginning of July. And in order to do that, believe it or not, there's still a significant amount of money left, even after the tax rebates under Mass General Laws, Chapter 62F. So generally speaking, this time of year, the administration will file what's known as a closeout supplemental budget to dispense with or allocate the remaining money so that then the comptroller can close the books and dictate where the money is going. This is not often a controversial item. This is often something that we do in an informal session. Oftentimes the money reverts to the general fund, or it goes to the stabilization fund, or it goes in some, and it does fund some deficiencies. The difference is now that the amount of money that we have includes an additional amount of surplus funding. And the governor in his closeout sup has pegged that at about $2.3 billion. And here's what's significant about that. In the closeout sup that he filed, the total is $1.622 billion. And of that $1.622 billion, about $840 million is net of the tax surplus. So here's what's interesting. The governor spends in the closeout sup a significant amount of money, but not all of it. And he allows that we would have about $1.5 billion remaining. And his argument is, and I agree with it, is that if you take that $1.5 billion and the $2.2 billion that we have remaining in ARPA funds, there is still enough money to fund the economic development bill, including the tax rebates. So the governor has taken a very interesting tack here, saying that I'm filing this spending bill, but it does not spend all of the excess money that's available, even after the tax rebates. There is enough money after the closeout sup were to be passed to still do the economic development bill. So in many ways, he's putting the ball back in the legislature's court, saying, I purposefully am not going to spend all of this,
Right.
in the hope that you will be able to address the bill that was unfinished at the end of the legislative formal session.
Well, I certainly hope the folks in that conference committee know this.
I assure you that they do. And I'm in the next few weeks, I'll be urging them to continue to meet and to come up with resolution reconciliation for the closeout, not the closeout stuff, but the economic development bill, in the hopes that we'll have something that we can work with to bring to fruition, again, the tax relief that's in that bill, but also some of the very important spending that's contained in the bill.
Well, speaking of relief, people are very worried about the winter. You know, the price of heating oil is astronomical, natural gas, and with all the issues around the world, it's just become kind of a crisis. And we are one of those cold climates that is looking at bleak times. So what's happening on Beacon Hill regarding that?
So it was brought to our attention, and we all learned, everyone did, that we are going to have a significant increase not only in home heating costs, but also in the cost of electricity in the coming months. And part of that is because Massachusetts has the majority of its electricity generated by gas-fired turbines in our electric plants. So it's going to be a double punch here in terms of space conditioning, in terms of home heating, if you heat with natural gas, and also the cost of electricity. And I would assume that the cost of oil heating is not going to be far behind. So we need to think about that. Certainly, folks need to think about their household budgets and begin to plan for a substantial increase. What we're dealing with now are projections, but we know that there'll be a substantial increase. In terms of the legislature, one of the things that we do is provide funding for folks of low income to be able to heat their homes over the winter. And we do that with funding that's provided from a federal program called LIHEAP, the Low Income Housing Heating Assistance Program. And so the federal government gives us money every year to be able to provide that kind of assistance, but the legislature appropriates those funds. And oftentimes there's a discrepancy between when we start to get cold weather and when we receive the federal funding. So in a number of years in the past, I've sponsored amendments or legislation with my colleagues to be able to advance the funding so that the LIHEAP program can have funding. And it's important to note that we are so well served in our area by Action Energy and Elliot Jacobson, who is considered a leader across the Commonwealth in this issue. And we've been in touch with Elliot, and we've been in touch with the community action agencies all across the state. And we're starting the conversation now about what are we going to need to do to respond to the new information that's come forward. And part of that is there is a rate case that has been filed by some of the energy companies already with the Department of Public Utilities seeking the increase. And so that's going to be a matter of public discussion as well. But certainly right now, we're thinking about what is it that we need to do to make sure that Action Energy and its cohort agencies all across the state have the resources going into this winter to be able to help folks be able to stay warm, which, as you pointed out in New England, is not a luxury, it's a necessity.
Right. So is availability going to be a problem? I know in other parts of the world, they're talking about that.
You know, I don't know that I could speak to that responsibly right now in terms of what we might face. That certainly can be an issue. And in fact, when natural gas is in short supply, that's when you see LNG brought in, both to the offshore terminals that sit off of Cape Ann and also directly into Boston Harbor. And when it's brought in, it oftentimes goes to one of 21 satellite storage facilities that are maintained to ensure that we have enough natural gas. So there is a plan for that, and it's happened in the past. But again, we're dealing with a very volatile world market. We all know the situation in Ukraine has played out, particularly with regard to fuel that comes from Russia and what's going to happen with that. So we certainly have a lot to think about. And I right now cannot tell you about the supply situation, except to say that there is a plan in New England to try to have enough and to try to have enough in reserve. And I'm sure folks are thinking about that right now, but at the moment, I don't have more information. I will try to have some for the next time we speak.
All right, great. Well, we will definitely talk about this again. We have one last really nice story to touch upon. You went to Essex today and you had a very special meeting there. So do you want to tell us about it? I'm
delighted to tell you about it. And this is something that—
And I'm dying to go.
We don't speak enough about it. You know, the Essex Shipbuilding Museum, to its credit, has been working with the Mass Humanities folks, as well as with the Smithsonian Institution. And they have brought a traveling exhibit to Essex. It's on the 3rd floor of the wonderfully renovated town hall in Essex. And the exhibit is about rural America and rural issues, and the fact that we're at a crossroads with regard to those issues. And it is just a wonderful exhibit. It is interactive, and I would encourage everyone to see it. But really, this is a feather in the cap of the Essex Shipbuilding Museum. And the museum is wonderful any day of the week.
It is, yeah.
On its own merits. But this is really something that they should be applauded for, and I hope everyone is going to take advantage of it and go and see the exhibit. What happened today was one of a number of planned events in relation to the exhibit that happened at the museum itself, at the Waterline Center, where presentations were made about various subjects and how local issues interact with what's being displayed in the exhibit. And it was really interesting. There are a number of additional events planned for this, but most of all, folks should go and see the exhibit, which again is on the 3rd floor of Town Hall in Essex.
And as I understand it, the Smithsonian has chosen a number of towns around the country to take this exhibit. And it's an examination of rural America and how it has changed, right? But Essex is the first one.
It is the first one. And one thing that was interesting that I learned today is a number of the other communities, for instance, there were folks there from Hull in Massachusetts. That is the next town that's going to receive the exhibit. But I'm told that some of the other communities actually came to Essex to unpack the exhibit and build the exhibit.
Oh.
And so it was a real collaborative effort. And what I'm told is that that will happen as the exhibit moves about. So not only is it a connecting mechanism for communities across the country in what it displays, but also in how it's produced.
Right. And I love the fact that it started in Essex because, you know, talk about a really interesting rural story. This was shipbuilding from the 17th century, you know, and it's still happening there. So, and there's still some ties to shipbuilding in that little town. So that's really nice.
Well, and it's really something that we should all be proud of, is that Essex is still under the watchful eye and the guiding hand of Harold Burnham, is still producing wooden sailing vessels, which are historically significant and which are plying our waters. You know, anyone that went to the Schooner Festival saw a number of Essex-built sailing craft that were built in recent years on the harbor, continuing a tradition not only of shipbuilding, but also of seafaring.
Right, right. Well, so we will have all the information about that exhibit in the program notes here. So,
fantastic.
All right. Well, I look forward to finding out what else you're doing around Cape Ann next week.
Well, happy to talk about it again. There's a lot happening, and there's a lot being discussed on Beacon Hill, a lot happening locally. And one thing I would just say as we wind down here, Heather, is that there are so many things happening in terms of community events. And I've noticed the pace of those has increased. There are a lot of things going on. And I would encourage to get out and celebrate the wonderful part of the world that we live in by taking advantage of all of these events that are occurring.
I agree. I agree. Okay, well, we'll catch up with all of that next week.
I look forward to it. And again, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. And again, always thanks to 1623 for programs like this that help us all to keep connected. Even if we can't get to something in particular, we're connected to it by the great work that all of you do.
Thank you. And thanks for your work too. And we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you.
Bye. Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.